Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. The University of St. Joseph is so glad to have you here with us today. I am Raina Dighton-White. I'm the Director of the Office for Diversity and Inclusion. Each year, the Martin Luther King Planning Committee brings forward this program to your campus and our greater community. It is an honor and it's truly fun to collaborate with them each year to make sure that this event takes place. We welcome you all to the University of St. Joseph 2021 Martin Luther King Day Jr. celebration. Thank you so much.
I have a dream.
Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated as a champion for civil rights. But today, I want you to think about a different part of my dad's legacy. Something that you may not know, but it's more relevant today than ever. His fight against poverty and income inequality.
But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness.
When my father was shot in 1968 in Memphis, he was crusading for higher wages for black sanitation workers. Their work conditions were abysmal. Low pay, no sick leave, and many were on welfare. In a speech to the workers, Dad said the issue is injustice. The issue is the
refusal of Memphis to be fair and honest in its dealings with its public servants.
Today, my dad is revered, but in 1968, he was deeply unpopular. 2/3 of Americans disapproved of him.
Oh, I've been hit so many times, I'm immune to it.
The FBI said he was a communist, but he kept protesting anyway. I traveled with him as a kid throughout Georgia in preparation for the Poor People's Campaign. The idea was to rally people to Washington to press the federal government to provide jobs and income for the poor. This was his other dream, but he did not live to see it come to fruition. I think if my father saw the issues of poverty and income equality that exist today, he would be greatly disappointed. Back then, 25 million people were living in poverty. But today, it's close to 40 million, and some say it's much higher, while billionaires pay a lower tax rate than the working class. Americans who teach our kids, deliver our food, drive our buses, are struggling.
It is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages.
If we really want to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day and the principles that my father stood for, our whole government needs to step up. From creating a cabinet position focused on fighting poverty to passing a universal basic income.
There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will.
Good afternoon. I am Kevin Mohammed. I am a graduate student here at the University of St. Joseph School of Social Work. I'm so pleased to welcome everyone to the University of St. Joseph's annual celebration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. The MLK Planning Committee is proud to bring you this event and to bring it to the university and community members, and deeply appreciates your presence today. This year's program, His Dream Had a Plan, explores Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, which was the accompanying component to his social justice work. Dr. King recognized economic disenfranchisement would always undermine and disrupt any gains in civil rights. King believed he could have a multi-race campaign for an established standard of living and work conditions. In March 1968, the Southern Christian Leadership Council convened 17 members of all races to announce the Poor People's Campaign. That April, he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support striking garbage workers. And there he was assassinated on his hotel balcony of the Lorraine Hotel. Economic justice continues to be a unifying issue across sections of disenfranchised and underrepresented communities. And the work to raise and maintain a dignified standard of life still exists today. We are joined today by two public servants who also share in Dr. King's belief of a better society through economic opportunity for all. We are joined by Connecticut Treasurer Shawn Wooden as our keynote address, and guest panelist Reuben McDaniel, who is the president of DASNY. And now it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce Treasurer Shawn Wooden. Treasurer Wooden, the University of St. Joseph in advance thanks you and welcomes you for your words of guidance and wisdom.
Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you to the university for inviting me to join you today to reflect on Dr. King's commitment to economic and racial justice. I was just introduced, so you have a sense of who I am, but let me do it in a much simpler fashion. I am a descendant of slaves, a beneficiary of the civil rights movement, a father raising two black boys, Connecticut's only statewide African-American elected official, and the only African-American elected treasurer in the country. So I am here today with a grateful heart and a real recognition that history has its eyes on me and all of us. You see, in search of a better future, my parents left Georgia in the 1950s and came to Hartford to start a family. It was during those early days in Hartford, while my folks were struggling to raise our family, that Dr. King was traveling across the country fighting for social justice, economic justice, and the opportunity for all of us to have a shot at the American dream. And Dr. King's dream became our new hope of what a future could actually hold if America truly became a place of equality. Those images of the 60s and the lessons of the struggle for civil rights returned for me as I ran for this office in 2018. You see, that year our nation was also recognizing the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. And his son, Martin Luther King III, came to Connecticut from Atlanta and endorsed my candidacy for state treasurer. He told me, Shawn, you need to win this. And when elected, you need to use the power of your office to change communities for the better. Well, my friends, I've been trying to live up to Martin's challenge and help deliver on the legacy of Dr. King, because Dr. King's focus on economic justice towards the end of his life is just as relevant today as it was then. When we reflect upon the legacy of Dr. King, we often think of his decades-long fight for civil rights, and rightly so. But over 50 years ago, he organized the Poor People's March on Washington. This initiative recognized that as important as civil rights were, in order to improve the material conditions for the lives of many African Americans, there was a real need to focus on economic justice. He said then, quote, "This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The question is whether America will do it. There is nothing new about poverty. What is new is that now we have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will. end quote. Unfortunately, before that march took place, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, while helping to organize sanitation workers. My friends, I want to emphasize today that Dr. King did more than dream. He acted. He called upon people of goodwill of his generation to act, and he continues to call upon us to act today. And we would do a disservice to his legacy and those who marched with him, bled with him, and died with him if we didn't do everything within our power to answer that call. Now, here in Connecticut, we face jarring inequality, where the wealthiest among us grow richer and richer, while the poorest fall even further behind. Dr. King delivered a brilliant address less than a month before he was gunned down entitled "The Other America." In it, he argued that there were literally two Americas. He said, "One America is flowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality. That America is made up of millions of young people who grow up in the sunlight of opportunity." He contrasted this to the other America that has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. He went on to say, in that America, millions of people find themselves forced to live in inadequate, substandard, and often dilapidated housing conditions. In this other America, thousands, even millions of young people are forced to attend inadequate, substandard, inferior quality less schools, end quote. Dr. Free, unfortunately, the realization here is that even though we are gathering more than 50 years after Dr. King delivered those remarks, we are still witnessing, experiencing, and living many of the same problems that he described so long ago. In fact, some of these challenges have grown even deeper. These words were true in 1968, and they remain true today. The inequalities that Dr. King fought against during the last year of his life continue to be one of the most pressing issues facing our country. Let me quickly share a few data points. In 2019, a McKinsey study showed that if we close the racial wealth gap, we can grow our gross domestic product between 4 and 6 points by 2028. A 2020 Citigroup study showed that if the U.S. had closed key racial gaps for Black Americans in wages, housing, education, and investment 20 years ago, $16 trillion could have been added to the U.S. economy. And if these gaps are closed today, $5 trillion could be added to U.S. GDP over the next 5 years. And last year, a Goldman Sachs economist said that by not addressing structural and systemic racism in our country, we are severely harming our economy and markets. Do we have the will to confront systemic racism and economic inequality? The answer must be yes. Our soul as a nation, as well as our prosperity, require that we meet this challenge head on. And as many as you know, Connecticut is no stranger to longstanding economic and race-based disparities. Our state has the highest annual income per capita in the country, yet it also has the second highest income inequality. Over the past 50 years, the economic inequality gap has been expanding, and the pandemic has unfortunately only intensified these inequalities. Growing up in the north end of Hartford, I saw how inequality can affect a community. My chances of ending up dead or in jail were much better than becoming a partner in a major law firm or State Treasurer of Connecticut. If you haven't heard my story, you can probably guess some of the details. Hardworking parents and family, scholarships that led me to attending college, graduating law school, and having a successful professional career. Stories just like mine are romanticized and retold as an example of what can be accomplished if you simply have the determination. But determination alone is not enough, and my story is far from the rule. It's the exception. The truth is, we have not done enough to address inequality, nor have we done enough to address the insidious effects it has on Black and brown communities. What Dr. King spoke of a half a century ago continues to stunt the trajectories of too many people of color. So, the question remains, do we have the will to change this? Will we, a half a century from now, be able to say that we've successfully bridged the gulf between the haves and the have-nots, that we've moved Dr. King's plans forward? I believe we will, and I believe we must. At home here in Connecticut, I remain committed to Dr. King's agenda of economic justice. He continues to be an inspiration, and I intend to use my voice to move this fight forward. My office is actively working to advance a racial equity agenda that focuses on reducing systemic economic disparities and making long-term investments in our state's economy. I am pursuing this legislative agenda because I believe every child born in Connecticut, irrespective of zip code, should have an equal opportunity to thrive, and because we need to work now to address these inequities if we are going to build a future where everyone has a chance to succeed. So here we are, facing one of the most urgent moments that our nation has ever experienced. The coming year will clarify where all of us stand. Now, as Dr. King famously said, a dream deferred is a dream denied. And unfortunately, the dreams of too many residents of our state and our nation have been put on layaway for far too long. Now is the time to act. Now is the time for all of us who seek to honor his legacy to stand up and speak up. This is what history reminds us. This is what the present requires of us. This is how the future will judge us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. Next up, we are going to have a panel, and I would ask that you all continue to join us. We are so thankful to have Dr. Rona Free, the University of St. Joseph president, joining us today as my co-facilitator, and Reuben McDaniel, the CEO and president of the State of New York Dormitory Authority, DASNY, also known as DASNY. Huh?
All right, thank you very much to all of the participants today and Treasurer Wooden for that wonderful keynote address. Mr. McDaniel, in 1967, Dr. King explained why he was calling for a Poor People's Campaign March on Washington. He said, the president and the Congress have a primary responsibility for low minimum wages, for a degrading system of inadequate welfare, for subsidies of the rich, and unemployment and underemployment of the poor, for a war mentality, for slums and starvation and racism. That he called for a march in Washington suggests that Dr. King believed the federal government could fix these ills. And while poverty may have been reduced among populations of color, it remains and is borne disproportionately by Black families. So why were these decades of federal programs aimed at reducing poverty and inequality not enough? Were they the wrong policies? Were they not implemented well? Or was it something else?
Well, Dr. Free, thank you, and thanks to St. Joseph for inviting me to this talk. And Treasurer Wooden, great to hear you and see you again. Really appreciate being here, and my DASNY family always appreciates being part of these types of things. You know, his last speech, Dr. King talked about looking over the mountaintop and seeing the promised land. And I just can't imagine when he looked over the mountaintop that he saw a place where people had equal access to education, but it was unequal education they had access to. Or where the naming of a Roz Brewer, CEO of Walgreens, is newsworthy only because he's an African-American, or a promised land where 28 to 30% wage gap among African-Americans and whites, or a wealth gap of 171,000 to 17,000 for Blacks, or where Treasurer Wooden would be saying to us, he's the only African-American treasurer. And I could go on. I just can't believe that when we looked at the promised land, that's where he would see things 50 some odd years later. Our current policies have been based on equity, really on equality and access. But if you give somebody a 400-meter head start in a mile and say, okay, both of y'all can run the same, and oh, by the way, some of you have to carry another 25-pound weight. Now let's get started. You're never going to catch up that way. So, I think when you look at the conversations people have about policy around equity and access, equality and access, you miss the whole point of equity. And you miss the whole point of getting people in the right place to start. So, back in the Poor People's Campaign, two of the tenets, one was a guaranteed income level for all Americans, not just African Americans. And the other one was having access to training and education to have a productive profession. Can you imagine Dr. King looking at $15 minimum wage and having that be a debate now? I think not. Or promoting something called education choice as a way to really segregate education from haves to have-nots? I think not. I think we really need to talk about policies that promote equity, that promote the reliance on all of us to contribute to the economic future of the country. Treasurer Wooden was so correct in his statistics, and that is, it's not about black versus white. It's about the United States versus the world. We can't write off a third of our population and just say, hey, look, that whole population don't contribute, and think that we'll be able to compete. From an economic perspective, an intellectual environment, economy, we need to have everybody highly educated to compete against the rest of the world. So I think that's one place. So for me, I'm really thinking three things as tenets. One is rethinking education and training programs that really look towards, will this produce wealth-producing jobs in an intellectual economy? That doesn't mean that you have to say everybody has to be a PhD. What it means is that everybody has to have both the ability to work manually and intellectually to be productive. Second, I think on the economic support, we've had a lot of activity around targeting access to capital for African Americans, but it's all been around debt programs, where you can get better bonding or maybe get some working capital. But we don't really have access to ways to go out and talk to our friends and say, hey, look, Shawn, hey, can you invest $100,000 in my business as an equity partner? So we need to figure out how can we create equity investment in minority businesses that can give them a foundation to build on. And then quite candidly, I always say that it's not somebody else's problem. A lot of it's our problem. We need a cultural shift to be from a consumer, which we are as African Americans, a huge consumer, to investors, whether that's investing in businesses or in the stock market or in other places. We need to have a cultural shift where we say, let's go back to the Black Wall Street days. We are investors in our community, not consumers. And so we need to start there. I think we start with equity as opposed to equal, and we start with investment as opposed to access, then we can get somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. That was excellent. My question is for you, Treasurer Wooden. In the next few weeks, we expect a new federal COVID relief package and policies to follow. Legislative initiatives like this are often met with disdain when it involves providing cash aid to certain groups. Thus, our disparities in government programs persist from the time that Dr. King began his Poor People's Campaign. What do you think are some of the factors that play into that hesitation to fund our long-term government initiatives that raise our standard of living for our low-income as well as no-income populations?
Well, once again, thanks for inviting me to join you today for this really important conversation. And I think a lot goes into it. One is still a failure of what I will call the political and the policy leadership to fully grasp the magnitude of the role of systemic racism, systemic discrimination in our country. And once you really understand that, and that it's not just, it was the government of the United States for years played an active role in systemic discrimination, while at the same time, there was government policy that supported home ownership, for example, for whites, and at the same time discriminated and limited access to African Americans. And we all know, folks who pay attention to this, that equity in a home is one of the ways that communities have built wealth over time. And so I think it starts with the lack of recognition. And so you struggle at the policy level to address these issues. And then once you start to address it, thinking about policies that really can empower communities and individuals in a long-term systemic ways. Sometimes from a policy perspective, quite frankly, some are comfortable putting a Band-Aid on something that requires surgery. And I would argue
that the challenges we face now requires deep surgery, and we are still right in this debate right now with the COVID package. Everybody, if there was ever a year that showed the glaring disparities in health, and in particular, and in economics, 2020 was it. In this racial reckoning. So I think we have a better shot as a result of some of the tragedy of last year of having more Americans. I call the murder of George Floyd as our modern day Emmett Till moment, where more Americans could see the ugliness of racism and the abuse of power, and more Americans are committed now to addressing it. And it's incumbent upon all of us in policy and leadership positions to make sure we address it the right way. And so I'm watching the debate in Washington very closely in this COVID package, and in my role as one of the leaders of the National Association of State Treasurers, have been weighing in on certain aspects of this. But I think it's critically important that we seize this moment from a policy perspective to create solutions that are big, bold, deep, and systemic. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out with the Biden administration and our Congress.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think we all are. I think everybody's watching just for a host of reasons. But that was great. Thank you so much. I wanted to actually see if there was any follow-up on this. Reuben, do you have anything that you'd like to provide?
Before you speak, Reuben, and I mentioned this in my remarks earlier, but we have to address this mythology of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And it's a mythology that those who are successful in society have simply pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. It's a mythology that many people in America actually have boots with straps to even start with. And so we have to deal with that mythology. And once we do, you asked a question about policy. If we actually think about that, that will help us create policies that actually provides bootstraps for one to have that opportunity, right? And that's the key, right? Having the opportunity, because we have proven time and time again, given the opportunity to succeed in a fair chance and a purely a true merit-based system, talent will rise of every color, of every gender, of every race and religion, right? Baseball never knew how baseball could be until Jackie Robinson got the opportunity to demonstrate it. And so I just wanted to add that to my remarks but we have to stop, whether it's me or others, saying, see, he did it, she did it, why can't you? We all have our different stories, but everybody gets help.
And Treasurer, I want to share a story that I think you'll appreciate, but emphasize that point. When I was a young investment banker, maybe 30, 35, I met a young man, a Caucasian man, who ran an investment fund. And at the time, it was about $1 billion fund. And he was telling me about how difficult it was to get started. He was like, "Oh, Reuben, it was so difficult. I had to, really scrape and scrounge." I said, "Well, tell me about it." He said, "Well, I went to 2 meetings to raise money and got told no." And so I decided to call my mentor at Goldman Sachs. My mentor at Goldman Sachs then said, "Call this person." I went to that person and he gave me my first $100 million. Now, to me, that's not struggling. That's not difficult, right? Because I had nobody at Goldman Sachs to call, no track record to be part of. I mean, I had no boots on. And so for him to say, not only was it so difficult for him, that was his mentality, but also to not recognize that I didn't have the person at Goldman Sachs who would have introduced me to, the treasurer of Connecticut and this was not a Connecticut investment. But I look at people like you and myself who are in positions, we have to be the ones that really get out and say, we're going to give some people some boots, right? And so when we talk about this COVID relief package, there will be a lot of money in schools, in infrastructure, in other programs. And we need to make sure that our community gets their fair share, not only of the direct dollars. I mean, we all look at, these direct payments as being helpful, and that's true. But the real place where you'll see people in 3 or 4 years from now talk about how successful they were in COVID is in infrastructure construction, right? It's going to be in getting reopening loans for restaurants and small businesses. We have to be at that table. And if we're not, there'll just be another case where here the African Americans are who work hard, who try hard, who contribute to our community, who aren't getting their fair share. So in addition to what the federal government does, it's going to be incumbent on individual state leaders to take those monies and make sure that African Americans and other small businesses have the opportunity to be part of that for a long-term gain, because it could be transformative if we do it right. And it could really be devastating if we do it wrong. And so I really agree with you that we don't have boots on necessarily, but a lot of boots around. So let's go find some boots and pass them around a little bit.
That's right.
So one of the things that we heard Dr. King say in the opening video was that in America, we have the techniques, we have the resources to eliminate poverty and inequality, but he asked the real question is whether we have the will. So even today, there's opposition to anti-poverty and anti-racism policies and programs, some of it because of the feeling that it's a zero-sum game, that if a Black person gets a job, it means that a white person does not. If a brown woman gets funding to start a business, it means that a white woman does not. So how would you respond to this type of concern? Let's start with Mr. McDaniel.
Well, two things. One is, I do believe there was a time in this country a long time ago when the pie was not endless. And so there was the sense that if I took a job, it was taking it from someone else. But that's just not the case today. And anybody who tells you that is just wrong. This pie, with the intellectual capital we have as a country, is humongous. And so I'm not saying you need to spread your wealth to me. What I'm saying is, help me get some pie. Help me with some ingredients to get the pie. Give me the access, because if I have that, I'll make my own pie. I'm not trying to take your pie off your table. And so I think it's a fallacy. I mean, we do have the techniques, but I think it's a fallacy, this zero-sum game fallacy. We can create our own wealth if we're given access to the ingredients. I don't need the pie. I need the ingredients. And so I think if people start talking about this, and there's Newt Gingrich is not someone I quote often, right? But he's the one that started with, if you write off the 30%, the low 30%, as a country, we won't be able to compete, because in India, you have, over 1 billion people. Well, if 4% of those are engineers and 4% of the United States is engineers, they'll beat us every time, right? But as a practical matter, there's a huge pie out there, and we just have to have the will to say, yeah, there are a lot of techniques, and access is the technique. Broadband access is a technique. Why can you drink water and that be all right, but not have access to broadband so I can compete, right? That's just, we got to just look at our society differently. You give me access to broadband, you give me access to capital, keep your pie, right? I'll make my own pie, because it really is endless. And that mentality just has to shift. I'm not taking from someone else. And it's odd to me when you see, Caucasians who are in a situation where their lack of education has held them back, competing with African Americans whose lack of education has held them back. There's plenty of pie to go around. The education is something that you can give and still have, right? So we all have access to the right education. We just have to change our society to say, we're not putting it at each other. We're competing with India and China and Russia and everywhere else. That's where the competition is.
Treasurer Wooden, any thoughts?
Yeah, and I would add some of the statistics I pointed out earlier is actually demonstrating that we can grow the pie. And by making sure everyone has an equal opportunity, and by removing systemic barriers to that, we're expanding the pie. But I would also say that people need to ask the question, if you feel like you have, are you okay in a society as a matter of principle with someone else being systemically held back, or community, while another community is being systemically propped up in advance? Is that the type of inequality that, one, you think our country was founded upon. Now, I'm not going to get into kind of, or maybe I have gotten into the practices of our country, but as an American, as someone who actually believes in these ideals, I think the answer to that is, even if you have that concern, you have to recognize that that's not who we aspire to be as a country. But going back to the point, it's an expanding pie and opportunity, and it's a net positive for every community, every state, for our nation, to make sure that a rising tide truly does lift all boats.
And I would agree 100%, Treasurer. I think that, your point there about, the haves and have-nots and the rising tide lifting all boats. But I think if we can embrace that and say, it's not capitalism's not the problem. It's the systemic challenges that people have imposed on top of capitalism go far beyond, Econ 101, right? And it's just unnecessary. I mean, it is fine for us to have Tampa Bay Bucks fans and have Kansas City Chiefs fans arguing about being fans, right? But we all love the game of football, right? So we can be on different sides or go to different churches and all those things. But when it comes to capitalism, we should all have the same ability to get on that field and play. And that's where we really have to think about as a society. It doesn't mean you have to eat with me or hang out with me or like the same team I like. It is, if I'm doing better, the pie is bigger, and your opportunity to do better is there. And that's where we have to change the whole focus, I believe, just from the systemic racism component shouldn't be such a negative issue. It should be, let's fix that so we can fix capitalism, right? It benefit all of us.
That's right. It's like we have the Super Bowl coming up, right? And nobody wants to see, I recall seeing like really, really lopsided games, falling asleep by halftime, saying you want to see the best talent possible, right?
A great game, right?
Right. And even if you have a preference, you want to see a good game. And I say for America, right, we ought to want to see the best talent possible on the field every day. And that's as in a Super Bowl, moving the game forward, as in baseball, moving the game forward with Jackie Robinson. We can move our game forward towards our ideals as Americans. If we truly remove barriers to talent rising.
I think too, if those of us in finance remember Reginald Lewis, right, really the first black billionaire, and you say, well, what did he have the rest of us didn't have? He wasn't smarter than us. He didn't have more contacts than us. He knew more people than us. He had access to capital in the junk bond market that turned out to be something that was a fallacy over time for everybody, but he had access to it, right? So he was able to raise capital for some businesses that he couldn't have done before. And quite frankly, that is now a place where we can't compete, now. But what it shows us is, if you give us access to capital on the same level, we could be the Reggie Lewises, right? Nobody, Reggie Lewis, like I say, he was a bright guy, clearly, but he wasn't any smarter than anyone else. But he did have that access to capital to really be able to go out, buy a small company, leverage it through the junk bond market, and then build a great business that was a multi-billion-dollar business. That's where we have to remember those lessons.
Yeah.
So this is a question that from the audience that I think we've already addressed a little bit, but maybe there's something that you'd like to add. So the question is, there's a lot of fear that economic and workplace equity will mean that African Americans and other minority groups will take over the economy, or at least reverse their traditional advantage of white Americans. Is that actually possible in any meaningful way? Treasurer,
I'll be happy. Either one. Go ahead, Treasurer, and I'll jump in after.
The demographics of this country are shifting. Everyone knows it. And so over a period of time, in fact, our Hispanic community, is growing rapidly. So the demographics will be shifting, or they are actively shifting. The notion of takeover, right, implicit in that is, I think of takeovers as bad things. I want to talk about this in terms of, building an inclusive corporate workspace, an inclusive America, and if we build it with those values, the demographic makeup, it shouldn't matter. right? And that everyone, irrespective of race, creed, beliefs, will have those equal opportunities to rise or fall, succeed or fail, based on the merit. And so I think it will happen in terms of the shift. It won't be a takeover, but it will be a transition. And if we do this right, as a country, we'll all end up, in a more equitable and inclusive society. And I will add, as a treasurer, I never veer too far away from statistics, data. In fact, there are studies that actually show a correlation between diverse workplaces and higher performance, higher worker satisfaction. A lot of the things that kind of we measure the corporate experience by, including the bottom line. And so there are lots of reasons why we shouldn't fight this. We should embrace it and propel it, because we will be better sooner if we do that.
I also think that, it would be helpful if we change the narrative of taking it from someone. I mean, I would, my Native American brothers out there are like, wait a minute, whose country is this? Whose country is this, right? It's not your country or our country, right? It's everyone's country. And we also participate in making this a better place for all of us. Right? No one's taking something. You can't take over something that they, doesn't belong to, quote, them, whoever them is. But the, popular and the right-wing press always talks about, if African Americans get this, then it will be taken from someone else. And we have, as a culture, we have these values that we are so beholden to. Well, my values are different than your values, but that doesn't mean either of us are right or wrong. It's just how I choose to live versus how you choose to live. But there's a common set of rules, a common set of resources, a common set of talent that we all come together. Yeah, what you do on Saturday doesn't matter to me. It's just what you do from 9 to 5, 5 days a week. Let's figure that out. But we need to change the narrative about this, this takeover. That's not even a possibility, because there's nothing to take over. I also think that, when you look at people saying things like that, they're not willing to do the work to get to where they need to get to, right? Because it is not granted just because you were born of one color or another that you're then slotted into where you should be from an economic perspective going forward. That, no one said that. That's not in the Constitution anywhere, right? And so I think we just have to change that narrative.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was great. We have another question from the audience. Talent is often cited as a barrier. How do we promote recognition of the economic potential of many minorities who have less privilege, education, mentorship, etc.? Either one of you can feel free to jump in on that one. I think we have covered part of that, but talent is oftentimes given as pretext, right? As the barrier for why we can't get this started.
I'm going to challenge the treasurer with a question that he can answer. He can answer that question. I bet, and I think you would agree, I bet that if I had anyone with a college, even a high school math understanding of pluses and minuses and analysis, that in 3 months' time, I could teach them present value theory enough that they could structure a bond transaction, right? It's a very focused thing that, quite frankly, the math is not complicated at all. And one of my benefits in life was I had a mentor very early on when I was young who said, look, son, let me just teach you how to do this, right? He just sat with me day in, day out. So it's not a talent issue, right? It is mentorship, education, those types of things. And Treasurer, I just would be interested to see how you felt about, some of the current education programs and the, kind of how we view this talent issue. Because it doesn't seem to be, I don't think it's talent in my view.
Well, it's definitely not innate talent.
Right.
So, it's about developing potential. And, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so focused on young people, right? And whether it's, the Chet College Savings Program and baby bonds, which is legislation I'll be introducing, but it's about harnessing that potential early and creating a pathway. And so innate talent, no, but there's when you have, Dr. King talked about the disparity, in education systems. When you have these really gross disparities, it's hard to to, you get to the point where you're being measured objectively and supposedly on merit, but the example of you being held back, while somebody else is running the 400, and it looks like they're just more talented when they had mentors propelling, right? It's like I was fortunate to have some mentors at critical points along the way, and you have different things, and so it's about fully developing all the talent that exists, and that hasn't happened. So the infrastructure around what it takes to bring that to fruition is critically important. And I've seen it. I've seen it so many times, whether it's in the kind of in legal context as a former lawyer, whether it's in finance and as treasurer, of talent existing or clear talent and demonstrable talent being overlooked because of bias. And when you're in a business like finance and you look at numbers, performance, track record, pedigree, right? And there, over the last year, there have been some powerfully written pieces around this from people inside who have become successful, but tell their story of those biases. When you go to the same schools, you produce, you work at the same firms, and then you go out of the Goldman Sachs's, for example, and start your own firm. You're treated very differently if you're a person of color, oftentimes, in terms of the access to opportunities, than if you're not. And so I've seen it play out. So I agree. It is not. Do we need to develop more potential?
Absolutely.
In Black and Brown communities, and on Native American reservations, and you name it, absolutely. But that's the issue. It's not that because we're artificially decreasing the pipeline. That's what we're systemically doing over a period of time, and it starts early.
Let me talk about how it starts early, Treasurer. I was the chairman of the Atlanta School Board, and so I know this firsthand. I'm going to compare two schools in the system. Both had the exact same per child funding, okay? One in the lower socioeconomic had a PTA budget of $1,300 a year. The other one in the higher had a PTA budget of $750,000 a year. You tell me that's fair, right? The other strategy inside of Atlanta Public Schools was give bad teachers a good recommendation and then transfer them to a school where parents would not raise heck about having a bad teacher in the classroom. And you know what happens over time, right? All of a sudden you have these schools in the lower socioeconomic part of the city that have the poor performing teachers, that have all the discipline problems, and they've got this PTA budget. I've got the other side of town where you've got this school that has now all of the teachers who have moved up. They had a concierge at the front door. When you walked in, you could walk in, the concierge would say, okay, Mr. Wooden, your child's in such and such class, and she needs so-and-so and such and such. Oh, you want to get lunch? It's just different, right? And so you say, oh, we funded the schools equally. Well, that's just not the truth. And we just need to start having the real conversations, right? An equal education is not going to be equal if you let the system do the work, right? You got to create equity that really provides a way for people to say, yeah, this kid has talent, but he also needs mentoring and education of things that will help, boost that talent up. You take any of those little kids, the precious, 5-year-olds, and put them in an environment where they have a concierge service and great teachers, they'll be all right, right? I mean, they'll be okay. And I've seen it with my own eyes, so I know that it works.
So there was actually a question from the audience that relates directly to what you were just talking about, but maybe there's an opportunity to talk even more about this point. So the question is, I'm interested in the panelists' thoughts on how we can increase equity in educational access. And so you've talked about it, the concierge at the door, and obviously that's symbolic. But what other thoughts do you have? And to what extent does educational access and success relate to housing and other structural context issues?
Go ahead, Treasurer Wooden. You could start. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, you raise a good point with housing and, with the de facto segregation that still exists in housing now. You have concentrations of poverty. Yes, there is a correlation between concentrations of poverty in the classroom and educational outcomes. And so housing does become important in that with the kind of the resource question. The reality is, in Hartford, it's just it's different from wealthy communities, right, in terms of the challenges and the range of options. So when you do the per pupil spending, as compared to some other systems, it doesn't take into account so many additional services. Even English learners, right, where English is a second language that they're learning, and the cost structure in many communities where newer Americans immigrate to. Right. So there's so many aspects of it. So one, sometimes they say it's not about money, but yeah, money is important in terms of this issue of equity and how you actually address for these things. The preschool, and you will see a huge disparity in early childhood education and what's available in poorer communities, Blacker and browner communities, and that head start in life. And when I was city council president in Hartford, I spent a fair amount of time talking with the superintendent of schools about, creating a universal pre-K and how powerful that would be, right? In our debate, which I will share, and this is a former superintendent, our debate was, Council President Wooden, if we can't afford to sustain that investment, it'll be lost. And so the discussion was building backwards to make sure that that investment early on, right? And, educational expert. So I just pretend to be one from time to time. But I got the point, right? And so I remain a big believer in universal pre-K, because I say that disparity starts early. And so we need to invest in things. And this is what really gets me. There are things that every educator knows that works, right? So early investment in education, preschool, big investment, big payoff. Smaller class sizes, and just can't do it in a lot of communities. And so, but if we invest in the things that we know that works, that's half the battle in making that commitment. And then when you go up to college or whatever, it's about, the big issue is affordability and access. It was just impossible for me to attend Trinity College without the academic scholarship that I received. And, but I was just one of a handful. And so I think those are some of the things, but we have to deal with access, costs, so many of these issues. So it's really pre-K through post 12 that we have to look at that entire spectrum.
And one of the things we know about education is that if a child cannot read to learn by third grade, that child's probably pretty well done, right? It's just hard to get to the next level without that. And
Reuben, I hate to interrupt, but
no.
Just to say something that many people may or may not know is those who plan on prisons and projecting out can actually look at those statistics in terms of what's happening in certain demographics by third grade to actually plan prison construction.
No, that's absolutely right. Because if you don't learn to read, for understanding and be able to read to learn by the third grade, prisons, prison and military are probably the two places you'll end up, right? Which is unfortunate. It's unnecessary. And I agree that the pre-K is incredibly important. Most students need to have seen letters and know how to count by the time they get to kindergarten. That's just not the truth for a lot of our country. Right? A lot of folks, send their kids to school never having picked up a book at all. And for those of us like, how could that be? I've read to my kid from the time they're two. That's just the reality. And this universal pre-K helps at least get the folks who don't have the capacity. I worked with a woman. She had a difficult time. She had a young kid. She needed to move, blah, blah, blah. I got her a place to live. And I said, have you got your child enrolled in school yet? Well, no, Mr. McDaniel, I haven't got there yet. Well, it was like October, right? I mean, she was just trying to survive. She was trying to get a place to live and get eating. And, she wasn't thinking about this poor 7-year-old who's now going to start school a month and a half behind. And so we need to have a commitment as a country to say, forget, equality or equity. Every person in this country should be able to read to learn by 3rd grade. Let's figure out how we make that happen. Then this idea of investing and return on investment will take care of itself.
Yeah, and can I add to that? And I know we're getting short on time here, but I spent a lot of time with literacy and thinking about it when I was on the Hartford Public Library Board, right? And understanding the staggeringly high levels of a lack of literacy in the greater Hartford or Hartford community in particular. And then when you think about the difference of kids growing up in households with parents who are very literate, and in the vocabulary that you just get from growing up every day is different. And so the number of words, right, which becomes important when you think about SAT tests later, when you think about reading, the number of words. And so the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving gave a grant to actually do in-home, to support in-home daycare arrangements, curriculum, but to try to close that gap between just because you're a kid growing up in a home with a parent who doesn't use as many words. But that is powerfully important. And so we have to look at, I would say, we have to look inward as parents, as what we can do to change this, as well as looking at, from a policy and programmatic perspective, things that structurally actually go to the root causes and start to address and close those gaps, if we're going to give everyone an equal opportunity in life.
Thank you all so much. We are 2 minutes left into our program, and oh my, we could talk about this all day. I know, but this is wonderful. One last thing, very quickly. What can we as individuals do, specific actions, activities to address racial inequity? How can we take up our own responsibility on this matter?
I think one thing we could all do, I'm going to let Shawn have the last word. One thing we could all do is elect people like Shawn Wooden to our state policy positions, right? Because it really does start at the policy, and elections do matter. The outcomes of elections do matter. I think that's one place. The second is just changing how we talk about these things is going to be important. So that we talk about, if you are a capitalist trying to make this a better country, you need a workforce that is educated and is equal in all of those things. And, really trying to get the systemic racism as not being such a negative term, just being a fact. Okay, that's a fact. Now I know that fact, I've got a knee that is bummed. That's the fact. So let's solve that problem. Let's do surgery. Don't make me live around for the rest of my life. Let's do surgery. And Treasurer, I'm really proud of you. I just want you to know, great work on your end. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, Reuben. And I would just encourage everyone that we all have a voice. We all have a role. We all have a lane. They're different, right? I'm a treasurer. Reuben's the CEO of New York Dormitory Authority. President Free is the head of a university. But we can all use, wherever we are, to use that platform, that voice, to raise these issues and to confront them in that space. And I would say that's critically important. And I'll close with this. Last year I made a corporate call to action of CEOs and challenging them to get in the fight to address systemic racism and to close racial economic disparities. And in that, I was surprised at the outpouring and the reaction from so many CEOs. And that's led to this initiative with the Ford Foundation around this, and 18 major CEOs committed to this. But I said, one of the untold stories of the commitment level of these CEOs is not just what they witnessed and saw, like, all Americans last year, but what they learned about their employees and that they never knew the outrage inside their organizations and the pain and the stories that they heard. And that is the most unreported story that has moved CEOs powerfully to really feel this and want to address it. And so I would just say to everyone, what can you do? Know that you have a voice, and be courageous, because the future, your future, whether it's professional, education, depends on you having the courage to fight for equity and inclusion and advancement. And just know that it makes a difference. It does, wherever you sit or stand.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This was just wonderful, and you've certainly brought forward a conversation today, both of you, that embodies the University of St. Joseph Mercy spirit. I thank you all for an enthralling conversation. Dr. Free, thank you so much for helping me co-facilitate this event. Treasurer Shawn Wooden, Mr. McDaniel, again, I hope that you two continue these strong conversations as state neighbors. Please feel free to call upon me if I can ever be of service to either one of you in the efforts to support students. But this concludes our program. University of St. Joseph thanks all of you out there today for joining us. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions about the program. You can come back to this website and view this program again if you need to. And again, we are at the end. Anything else to say, folks? Would everyone like to say goodbye before we sign off?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good luck, everybody. Be safe.
Stay safe out there, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.